Now it's time for fraction division B. This is lesson 8 in unit 3, and this lesson talks about dividing a fraction by a whole number, where the previous lesson talked about a whole number by a fraction. When you first start out, it does review a little bit about multiplying fractions with the standard algorithm, and then it heads in to showing how you can divide, or the meaning of division, and then how you can divide a fraction by a whole number. So they've taken this third and divided it into two parts. Now, I think that this modeling is a little bit confusing, and I am going to show you why, and with my document camera. So here I have that same thing. They had 1/3 divided by 2, and so I am going to show you with my fraction circles. The thing that they did not talk about is that when you're talking about a fraction, you're talking about a part of the whole, and they didn't represent the whole. They only had that one bar that showed 1/3. And so when they divide that by 2, it was kind of abstract, and I'll go back to look at that model again. It just all of a sudden became two groups of 1/6. And so unless you have something to actually model it with, or you're thinking about that entire whole, now if we divided each section just like we did here, each of the thirds into 2, we can see that there are now 6 equal parts. If I just take that and I divide it in half, I really can't see that there's 6. So what's important, and I'm going to draw a circle just to represent my thirds so you can see what I'm talking about. So here's my thirds. If I'm going to divide my thirds by 2, then I'm going to add an additional line. Each third's going to be divided by 2. So in this one section that I already had, this 1/3 divided by 2, I can see that I have a 6th here because all of these are now 6th. I don't just have 2, I have 2/6. So the answer is going to be 2/6. So we definitely want students to think not just about that one piece, but we want students to think about that whole. And if we divided that whole, we have 2/6, not just 2. So when we look back at the OLS, I feel like students may kind of get confused about all of a sudden why there's a 6th if they're not thinking about the 3/3 and how there are 6 parts when you divide each into 2. Here's another example. I have halves, and so I'm going to show you with my document camera. It says we have halves, but we're going to divide it by 4. So here's my halves. Well, if I divide it by 4, I have to do whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. So let me move right over here. I'll do a smaller picture. Here's my half. And if I divide it by 4, this half, remember, we're working on, I'm going to put 4 here. So I have all of these now. But those, we need to think about the value of those. Inside this whole circle, how many pieces do I have now? They're now turned into 8s. So I have 4 8s. And if we had a model that was the same size, we could lay it on top and we could easily see that. And there are printable fraction circles and bars. Sometimes circles are a little harder to work with than a fraction bar, but we definitely want students to visualize this, because otherwise the way it's modeled in the OLS could be a little bit confusing. So using that scratch paper as you go is very, very important. Here's another one. We have a half divided by 5. Well, remember, we're not just doing it to one half, we're doing it to the entire section. So when we're thinking about, okay, we have half and we divide each half by 5, what's the size of the pieces? What are they going to be at that point? And you can see with my document camera, a half divided by 5 is going to be tenths, because if I continued all the way around, I would have 10 pieces. So using those models and helping your students work it out as they complete this will be very, very important. So they think about the whole that this half is part of. As you go through the lesson, everything is online. There are no resources in the student activity guide. I will say right here, there is a fraction strips learning tool that I feel like would be very beneficial. Let's click on that and see. There also is an app for fraction strips. So as you're going through the lesson, if you don't have the manipulatives, you can use this to help model some of what we were just talking about. It's a great little resource that's kind of hidden in the corner. Here we have a number line, which is great to model. We have a third, but we're going to divide it into two pieces. Here we have a fourth. Right here's a fourth. We're going to divide it into three pieces. And you can see that when you divide the fourth into three pieces, you have to think about that whole. We have 12 twelfths in one whole, because 4 fourths and 12 twelfths equal that one whole. So we don't want to just stop right here. We want to think about all the way to 1. How many pieces would be all the way to 1? And if we divided each section by 3, there's 1/12. When we have 1/4 divided by 3, we have a 12th. And so those are great models. As I mentioned, there's nothing to complete that is not online. Here's another way to take what we did with multiplication, but kind of think about the reverse. The one thing that I mentioned in the previous lesson is we don't want students just to follow the rule of change the sign and use the reciprocal. But here we have 1/3, and we're going to divide it in half. So how much would it be? We would have 1/6. And so using that grid paper is a great way to model as well. Not all children are going to relate to the same type of modeling, so we're just exposing them to that. And then if they were to see a model like this, then they would be able to understand what they're talking about, because they start out with something large, they divide it up, and then they end up with the smaller portion. Students will not have to necessarily draw this type of model on their Georgia milestones, but we do want them to understand what fraction division is, and the models are what helps them conceptualize that. Again, they're going to talk about how multiplication and division are related, and so this kind of goes back to letting them see that here we have multiplication. We have 1/6 times 2. When we multiply following the standard algorithm, we have 2/6. And then as we go through, they're also going to relate that to division. So you start with this product as your dividend, you divide by 2, and they're going to show you how that you end up with 1/6. So it is the opposite, but we want students to understand it and visualize it before they just start flipping the sign or changing the sign and flipping to a reciprocal. There is a lesson checkpoint, and so let's check that out, and we'll go through some of the problems together. They will be very similar, but again, they could be a little confusing when the whole is not shown and just part of the whole is shown. So right here, it says which models can be used to solve this problem. So we have a half, but we divide it by 4. Well, here's a half, and it's divided by 4. And then we have the area model. We have half, and we divided the half by 4. And so you would see that this model really shows that you would have 1/8, whereas this one is a little more abstract because you don't really see that whole to see the 8 different parts. So this could be a little bit tricky. And like I said, I'm not thrilled with some of those models, but if you're working through it with your child and helping them explain it and see the whole first, it will be much better. We can see that we have a half divided by 3. Here we have 3 wholes, and we divided them by thirds. How many thirds or how many wholes do you have if you divide by thirds? And then here is more of one that does not have a model, but it says use any model. So that's where you can use your grid paper, you can use your fraction strips, you can use your fraction circles, anything that will help model this problem so that you can get the answer. And then here is another one where it does show the inverse operations of how multiplication and division are related. And always read the directions carefully, because it says there's two answers that would match. So this unit or lesson B is pretty basic. It does have some models that you may not have seen before, but if you work through your child and use those hands-on concrete manipulatives as you go through the lesson, I think it will make a lot more sense to them, and you will be able to then mark this lesson complete. So I hope that helps, and then we'll talk a little bit next time about the next unit or lesson C.